What would you do if, after 20 years, you returned to find your wife still holding the marriage paper and a daughter you've never met? Run again or finally face the truth? The courthouse bell finished its 9th chime as Thomas Wade descended from the Denver and Rio Grande coach, morning dust swirling around his polished boots. Centerville's main street stretched before him like a question he wasn't ready to answer, bordered by false-fronted buildings that wore their prosperity thin as paint. He'd left this place 20 years ago with nothing but anger and promises, and now he'd returned with a banker's coat and his father's sins folded in his vest pocket. The auction notice had found him in Colorado Springs 3 weeks past, delivered with a stack of legal papers that turned his morning coffee bitter. Wade Property, Willow Creek. Outstanding debt, $847. Public sale, October 15th, His father's signature on the promissory note had faded to brown ink, but the shame it carried burned fresh as a brand. Thomas adjusted his hat and walked toward the crowd gathering in the courthouse square. The auctioneer, a thin man with spectacles that caught the morning light, stood on a wooden platform, his voice carrying over the assembled farmers and merchants like a church bell calling sinners to account. Lot 16, the Morrison place on Cottonwood Ridge, the man announced, his gavel poised like a weapon. 40 acres of good grazing land, spring-fed creek, starting bid $25. Thomas found a spot near the hitching posts, close enough to hear but far enough to remain unremarked. He recognized some faces older now, lined with years of weather and worry, but none that turned his way with recognition. 20 years had changed him from a reckless boy to a man who wore responsibility like armor, though some armor had weak spots that old wounds could find. The Morrison place sold for $38 to a rancher named Kellerman, and Thomas watched the defeated slope of Morrison's shoulders as he signed the papers. The folded marriage certificate in Thomas's vest seemed to pulse with his heartbeat, a reminder of the choice that had driven him from this place when Sarah Brennan's father had called him unworthy, and his own father had drunk away the family's good name. Lot 17, the auctioneer called. The Murphy homestead on Bear Creek, 80 acres with house and outbuildings. Starting bid $30. That's when Thomas saw her. Sarah stood near the front of the crowd, her dark hair pinned beneath a simple bonnet, her hands folded over a worn leather satchel. She wore a grey dress that spoke of careful mending rather than poverty, and when she glanced toward the auctioneer, Thomas saw the same determined set to her jaw that had made him love her 20 years past. She'd kept his name. Mrs. Sarah Wade, though he'd never given her the right to wear it. The Murphy place sold to Henderson for $47. And Thomas watched Sarah's shoulders tighten as she made a note in a small book. She was keeping records, he realized, tracking the sales for reasons he couldn't guess but recognized as important. The Sarah he'd known had always been careful with numbers, whether counting eggs in her mother's henhouse or calculating the cost of fabric at Mitchell's store. Lot 18, the auctioneer announced, and Thomas felt the words like a physical blow. The Wade property on Willow Creek, 200 acres with house, barn, and outbuildings. Outstanding debt, $847. Starting bid, $400. The crowd murmured and shifted. $400 was serious money, in a place where most farms sold for less than $100. Thomas stepped forward without thinking, his polished boots loud on the packed earth, and Sarah turned at the sound. 20 years collapsed between them, like a house struck by lightning. Her eyes, still the color of creek water in spring, went wide with recognition, then narrowed with something harder to read. She saw the cut of his clothes, the gold watch chain at his vest, the way he carried himself like a man accustomed to being heard in rooms where money mattered. "Do I hear 400?" the auctioneer asked, scanning the crowd with professional patience. No hands rose. $400 was more than most men in Centerville saw in 2 years of good harvest. Thomas felt the weight of every eye in the square, including Sarah's, as he stood frozen between past and present, debt and deliverance. The morning sun climbed higher, casting sharp shadows from the courthouse eaves, and somewhere in the distance a train whistle called like a promise of escape that Thomas had already refused to take. 400 once, the auctioneer called, his gavel suspended in the autumn air. 400 twice. 500, Thomas said, his voice carrying across the square like the crack of breaking ice. A ripple of surprise moved through the crowd. Sarah's face went pale as chalk dust, her knuckles white where they gripped her satchel. The auctioneer's spectacles caught the sunlight as he turned toward Thomas with renewed interest. "We have 500 from the gentleman in the black coat. Do I hear 550? Silence stretched thin as wire. Thomas felt the weight of every stare, but Sarah's gaze burned hottest, not with gratitude, but with something closer to fury. She'd spent 20 years watching him stay away, and now he appeared like some dark angel to claim what his father had gambled away. Going once at 500, the auctioneer announced. 600, said a voice from the crowd's edge. Thomas turned to see a man in a tailored suit, his boots too clean for farm work, and his hands too soft for honest labor. Railroad money, most likely, or mine speculation. The kind of man who bought failing farms to parcel them for development, caring nothing for the families who'd worked the soil or the graves that dotted the back pastures. 650, Thomas counted, his jaw set like granite. The stranger smiled and raised a gloved hand. 700. Sarah stepped closer to the platform, her voice clear as a church bell. I invoke the Homestead Protection Act. This property contains a dwelling continuously occupied by family for more than 10 years. The auctioneer frowned and consulted a leather-bound book. Ma'am, that would require documented proof of marriage to the debtor or his heir. Sarah opened her satchel, with hands that barely trembled, and withdrew the yellowed marriage paper Thomas had given her the night before. He left signed by Pastor Hendricks, witnessed by her sister Mary, dated the 12th of April, 1867. She'd kept it through 20 years of waiting, through seasons of hope that turned to resignation that hardened into resolve. Mrs. Sarah Wade, she said, her voice steady as stone, legal wife of Samuel Wade, deceased, and by law guardian of his property interests. The crowd murmured like disturbed birds. Thomas felt the blood drain from his face as memories crashed over him, the hastily spoken vows in Pastor Hendricks's parlor, the kiss that tasted of tears and promises, the way Sarah had whispered, "Come back to me," as the eastbound stage pulled away at dawn. He'd carried her as his wife in his heart for 20 years, but he'd never dared hope she'd kept the paper that made it legal in the eyes of God and territory law. "That changes the bidding structure," the auctioneer announced, consulting his book again. "With a legal heir present, the minimum bid rises to cover the full debt, $847. The stranger in the tailored suit shook his head and stepped back into the crowd. 800 was gambling money. 850 was serious business that required bank loans and board meetings. "Do I hear 847? The auctioneer called. Thomas reached into his coat and withdrew a leather wallet, thick with banknotes. He'd come prepared to buy back his father's shame, but he hadn't expected Sarah to rise like a phoenix from the ashes of his abandonment. 847, he said, his voice carrying across the square like Judgment Day. Sarah turned to face him fully, and in her eyes he saw 20 years of questions that would require more than money to answer. The courthouse clock struck 10:30, its bronze voice echoing off the storefronts and false-fronted dreams that lined Centerville's main street. "Going once?" the auctioneer called. "Going twice?" "Wait," Sarah said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "I need to speak with the bidder before the sale is final." She walked toward Thomas with the steady pace of a woman who'd learned to carry weight without bending, her gray dress rustling like autumn leaves. When she stopped before him, close enough that he could smell the lavender soap she'd always favored, her voice dropped to a whisper that only he could hear. "Why now, Thomas? Why, after 20 years of silence?" He looked down at the marriage paper in her hands, its edges soft as moth wings, and saw his younger self's careful signature beneath Pastor Hendrick's blessing. "I came to pay my father's debt," he said simply. "I didn't know you'd kept." He gestured toward the paper, his throat tight with unspoken apologies. "I kept everything," she said, her eyes bright with tears she refused to shed. "Every letter you never sent, every promise you never kept, every night I waited for a knock on the door that never came." The courthouse bell chimed the quarter hour, its bronze voice marking time that couldn't be reclaimed. Around them the crowd waited with the patience of people accustomed to watching their neighbors' private sorrows become public spectacle. Thomas pulled the wallet from his coat, his movements deliberate as prayer. "The debt is mine to pay," he said. "But the choice of what happens next is yours." Sarah looked at the money in Thomas's hands, more cash than most folks in Centerville saw in a lifetime, and felt something shift inside her chest, like a door opening after years of being barred shut. The October sun warmed her shoulders through the grey wool of her dress, and for the first time in 20 years she allowed herself to imagine a future that included the man who'd left her with nothing but a signed paper and a heart full of unanswered questions. "I need to know why you left," she said, her voice pitched low enough that only Thomas could hear. "Not the reasons you told yourself on the eastbound stage, but the real reason, the one that's been eating at you ever since." Thomas glanced toward the crowd, where neighbors and strangers waited for the auction to resume, then back to Sarah's face. In her eyes he saw the girl who'd waited by the creek every evening that last summer, counting fireflies and dreaming of wedding dresses made from her mother's lace. "Your father said I'd never be anything but a drunk son," Thomas admitted, the words tasting bitter as burnt coffee. "Said you deserved better than a boy with empty pockets and a family name that meant trouble at the bank and shame at the church social. He wasn't wrong about the pockets." Sarah's hand moved to rest on his wrist, her fingers warm against the expensive fabric of his coat. He was wrong about everything else. The touch sent electricity through Thomas's arm and straight to his heart, where it lodged like a fishhook that couldn't be removed without tearing something vital. He'd forgotten the weight of her hand, the way she could calm his racing thoughts with nothing but the pressure of her palm against his skin. "I wrote you letters," he said, "dozens of them. Every week for the first year, then every month, then." He let the words trail off, knowing she could fill in the silence with her own mathematics of abandonment. "I never received them. I never sent them." Thomas looked down at their joined hands, his pale from indoor work, hers brown from garden soil and Montana sunshine. "I told myself you'd moved on, found someone worthy of the woman you were becoming. Sending letters felt like selfishness, like asking you to wait for a man who might never be good enough to come home." Sarah lifted his wrist and pressed it against her heart, where he could feel the steady rhythm that had kept time for 20 years of waiting. "I chose you before God and Pastor Hendricks," she said. "That choice doesn't expire just because you lost your nerve." The courthouse clock struck 11, its bronze voice blessing their reconciliation with the same solemnity that had marked their wedding vows. Around them the crowd grew restless, shuffling boots and whispered conversations that would become the day's gossip by evening. Thomas looked at the marriage paper, still clutched in Sarah's free hand, its yellowed edges soft as forgiveness, and made the choice that should have been easy 20 years ago. "Then let's go home," he said, his voice steady for the first time since he'd stepped off the morning coach. "Let's go home and start the life we should have had." The auctioneer cleared his throat, his patience wearing thin as the morning stretched toward noon. "Mrs. Wade, if you'd like to exercise your homestead rights, you'll need to present payment for the full debt amount within the legal window." Sarah released Thomas's wrist and stepped back, her business face settling over the softness that had appeared during their whispered reconciliation. "What's the window?" "Sundown today, ma'am. That's territorial law for auction settlements." Thomas felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came with deadlines and decisions that carried permanent weight. Sundown gave them perhaps 8 hours to navigate 20 years of separation, legal complications, and the question of whether love could survive the weight of so much accumulated silence. "We'll need to visit the bank," Sarah said, her voice carrying the practical tone that had helped her survive 2 decades of managing alone, "and the land office. And Pastor Hendricks, if he's still breathing." "He's still breathing," Thomas confirmed, remembering the ancient minister who'd married them in his parlor with nothing but candlelight and Sarah's sister as witness. "Though he must be pushing 80 by now." The crowd began to disperse as the auctioneer moved on to smaller lots, farm equipment, and household goods that wouldn't change anyone's destiny but might ease the burden of another hard winter. Thomas pocketed his wallet and offered Sarah his arm, a gesture that felt both foreign and familiar after 20 years of independence. They walked toward Centerville's business district, their footsteps synchronized without conscious effort, passing storefronts that bore names Thomas remembered, and others that spoke of change and progress. Miller's Mercantile had become Miller and Sons. The false front expanded and painted fresh white. The old saloon now bore a sign reading Murphy's Social Club, and the windows that had once been boarded after Saturday night brawls now showed clean glass and checkered curtains. The town's grown respectable, Thomas observed, noting the sidewalks that had replaced dirt paths and the gas street lamps that promised illumination after dark. "Everything grows up eventually," Sarah replied, her tone carrying layers of meaning that made Thomas glance at her profile. "The question is whether it grows towards something worthwhile." First National Bank of Centerville occupied a corner building that had been Kemp's Hardware when Thomas left town. The marble facade and brass fixtures spoke of railroad money and mining investments, the kind of prosperity that transformed frontier settlements into permanent communities with schools and opera houses and ladies' auxiliary societies. President Harrison, no relation to the territorial governor, was a man in his 50s with carefully waxed mustaches and the soft hands of someone who handled money rather than tools. He examined Thomas's bank drafts with the thoroughness of a jeweler appraising gems, checking signatures against signature cards and holding the papers to the window light to verify the watermarks. "Colorado Springs First National," Harrison murmured, making notes in a leather-bound ledger. "Excellent reputation. These drafts are negotiable immediately." He looked up at Thomas with new-found respect. "You're Samuel Wade's boy, aren't you? I remember when you left town. Your father spoke of you often." Thomas felt Sarah's eyes on him, but kept his expression neutral. "What did he say?" "That you'd make something of yourself, given time and distance from his mistakes." Harrison's smile carried genuine warmth. "Seems he was right, bank examiner, the drafts indicate. Respectable profession." "Respectable enough," Thomas agreed, though the word tasted strange in his mouth. He'd spent 20 years building respectability like armor against his father's reputation, but standing in Sarah's presence made him wonder if respectability was worth the cost of everything else he'd sacrificed. Harrison prepared the legal documents with practiced efficiency, debt satisfaction papers, property transfer forms, and a new deed bearing both Thomas and Sarah's names as joint owners. The ink was still wet when the courthouse clock struck one, its bronze voice marking the passage of hours that felt both endless and insufficient. 7 more hours, Sarah said as they stepped back onto the sidewalk. "What do we do with 7 hours to rebuild 20 years? Thomas looked at the marriage paper she still carried, its edges softened by 2 decades of careful handling. "We start with the truth. All of it. The ugly parts, and the parts that hurt, and the parts we've been too proud or too afraid to say out loud." Sarah nodded and turned toward the residential streets that climbed the hillside behind Centerville's business district. "Then we'd better head home. Some truths require privacy." They walked toward the Wade property on Willow Creek, their shadows growing shorter as the sun climbed toward its zenith, carrying between them the weight of questions that would require more than an afternoon to answer, but couldn't wait another day to begin. The house came into view as they crested the final hill, a 2-story frame structure with a wraparound porch and windows that caught the afternoon light like welcoming eyes. Smoke rose from the chimney, thin and steady as a prayer, and Thomas realized with a start that someone was home. "I've been taking care of it," Sarah explained, seeing his surprise. "Someone had to keep the roof patched and the pipes from freezing. I thought—" She paused, her voice catching slightly. "I thought if you ever came back, you'd want to find it the way you left it." Thomas stopped walking and stared at the woman beside him, the woman who'd spent 20 years maintaining his childhood home while he built a new life that deliberately forgot this place existed. The magnitude of her faithfulness hit him like a physical blow, and he understood for the first time the true cost of his abandonment. "Sarah," he began, but she was already moving toward the house, her stride purposeful and determined. "Save the apologies for after you've heard everything," she called over her shoulder. "Some stories require comfortable chairs and strong coffee, and some require more courage than either of us has shown so far." The front door opened before they reached the porch, and Thomas saw with shock that they weren't alone. A woman emerged, young, perhaps 20, with Sarah's dark hair and eyes the colour of creek water in spring. She wore a simple blue dress, and an expression of carefully controlled curiosity that reminded Thomas painfully of Sarah at the same age. "Mother?" the young woman said, her gaze moving between Sarah and Thomas with the quick intelligence of someone accustomed to reading between the lines of adult conversation. Thomas felt the world tilt beneath his feet as understanding crashed over him like cold water. 20 years of separation suddenly made horrible sense, and he understood with crystal clarity why Sarah had never remarried, never moved away, never stopped waiting for a man who'd left her with more than just a signed paper and broken promises. "Thomas," Sarah said, her voice steady as stone despite the tremor in her hands, "I'd like you to meet your daughter, Elizabeth." The courthouse clock struck 2 in the distance, its bronze voice marking time that couldn't be reclaimed, and Thomas Wade faced the greatest debt of his life, one that couldn't be paid with money from a Colorado bank, but required something far more precious and far more difficult to give. The afternoon sun slanted through the parlor windows of the Wade house, casting long shadows across furniture that Thomas recognized from his childhood, the horsehair sofa where his mother had mended shirts by lamplight, the oak table where his father had signed the promissory note that started this whole sorry business, the mantelpiece that still held the same china figurine of a shepherdess that had somehow survived 20 years of absence and sorrow. Elizabeth sat in the chair that had been Thomas's mother's favorite, her hands folded in her lap with the same careful composure that Sarah had always shown when facing difficult conversations. She'd inherited her mother's dark hair and determined jaw, but her eyes held something Thomas recognized from his own mirror, a restless intelligence that suggested she wouldn't be content with small-town life forever. "I've known about you my whole life," Elizabeth said, her voice carrying the directness of youth combined with the gravity of someone who'd grown up with adult responsibilities. "Mother never hid the truth. She told me you'd left before I was born, that you'd gone east to make something of yourself, and that someday you might come back." Thomas gripped his coffee cup hard enough to whiten his knuckles. The coffee was strong and bitter, the way Sarah had always made it, and it burned his throat like liquid courage. "What did she tell you about why I left?" "That you were young and scared and didn't know how to be a husband and father." Elizabeth's gaze never wavered from his face. "That your own father was a drunk who'd rather gamble than work, and that you were afraid you'd turn out the same way. That you thought leaving was the kindest thing you could do." Sarah spoke from her place by the window, where she'd been watching the western mountains catch the afternoon light. "I never lied to her about you, Thomas. But I never stopped believing you'd come back either. Maybe that was the cruelest thing I could do, give her hope that her father was a good man who'd simply lost his way." "Was I?" Thomas asked, the question scraping his throat raw. "A good man who lost his way?" Elizabeth leaned forward in her chair, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles showed white. "That depends on what you do next." The courthouse clock struck 3, its bronze voice echoing across the valley like a judgment bell. 4 hours until sundown, 4 hours to build a foundation for a family that had existed in Thomas's absence, shaped by Sarah's faith and Elizabeth's questions and 20 years of patience that most men wouldn't have deserved. Thomas set down his coffee cup and walked to the mantelpiece, where the shepherdess figurine caught the afternoon light. He'd bought it for his mother with his first wages from hauling freight, back when he was 14, and believed that hard work and good intentions were enough to overcome any obstacle. "I wrote you letters," he said, speaking to both women but looking at the figurine. "Hundreds of them. Every week for the first year, every month for the second. Then whenever the guilt got too heavy to carry alone. I told you about my job at the bank, about the houses I lived in, about the friends I made and the woman I almost married, before I realized I was already married to someone else." Sarah's reflection appeared in the window glass beside his own. "Why didn't you send them?" "Because I was a coward." Thomas turned to face his wife and daughter, the 2 people who'd shaped his absence as surely as if he'd stayed. "Because it's easier to carry guilt than to face forgiveness. Because I was terrified that if I came back, I'd prove your father right, that I really was nothing but a drunk son who'd drag you down with me." Elizabeth stood and walked to the oak table, where she opened a wooden box and withdrew a bundle of envelopes tied with blue ribbon. "Mother wrote you letters, too," she said, her voice matter of fact. "One every month for 19 years. She stopped last year on my 20th birthday." Thomas stared at the bundle as if it might explode in his hands. "You never sent them?" "I never had an address." Sarah's voice carried no accusation, only the simple truth of a woman who'd learned to live with impossible circumstances. "How do you mail a letter to someone who's decided to disappear?" The afternoon light shifted as clouds moved across the sun, throwing the parlour into temporary shadow. Thomas walked to Elizabeth and accepted the bundle of letters with hands that barely trembled, feeling the weight of 20 years' worth of unspoken words and accumulated love. "There's something else," Sarah said, her voice carefully controlled. "Something that will change the legal situation." Thomas looked up from the letters, his heart already sinking toward his boots. Sarah reached into her satchel and withdrew a second bundle of papers, these bearing official seals and legal signatures. "I filed for divorce last month, citing abandonment. The decree becomes final at midnight tonight unless you contest it in person before sunset." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow, knocking the breath from his lungs and the strength from his knees. He sank into his father's old chair, the letters sliding from his nerveless fingers to scatter across the floor like fallen leaves. "You're divorcing me." "I was." Sarah's voice strengthened as she spoke, gaining the force of a woman who'd spent months making an impossible decision. "I couldn't stay married to a ghost, Thomas. Elizabeth deserves better than a mother who spends her whole life waiting for a man who might never come home. I deserved better." Elizabeth moved to stand beside her mother, her young face set in lines that spoke of conversations they'd shared away from prying eyes and judgmental neighbors. The divorce papers were filed the same day the auction notice went out. "Mother said if you cared enough to come back for your father's debt, you'd care enough to come back for us. If you didn't—" She shrugged with the pragmatism of someone who'd grown up expecting disappointment. "And if I had?" Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Then you'd have to choose," Sarah replied, her eyes bright with tears she still refused to shed. "Really choose this time. Not just pay a debt and disappear again, but stay and build something real with the family you left behind." The courthouse clock struck 4, its bronze voice carrying across the valley with the weight of approaching deadline. 3 hours until sundown, 3 hours until his marriage officially ended or officially began again, 3 hours to prove that 20 years of separation had taught him something worth knowing. Thomas knelt and gathered the scattered letters from the floor, his movements deliberate as prayer. Each envelope bore Sarah's careful handwriting, his name spelled out in ink that had faded from black to brown over the years, addresses that changed as he'd moved from rooming house to apartment to the respectable Victorian he'd bought in Colorado Springs. "I want to read them," he said, his voice steady for the first time since Elizabeth had walked out of the house. "All of them tonight, after we settle things with the courthouse. I want to know what 20 years looked like from your side of the silence." Sarah nodded, her composure finally cracking enough to let hope show through. "And I want to read yours, the ones you never sent. I want to understand the man who left as much as the man who came back." Elizabeth walked to the window and looked toward town, where the courthouse clock tower rose above the rooflines like a finger pointing toward judgment. "The courthouse closes at 5, she said. If you're going to contest the divorce, you need to leave now." Thomas stood and reached for his coat, then stopped and looked at the two women who represented everything he'd run from and everything he'd spent 20 years trying to deserve. "Will you come with me?" he asked, the question encompassing more than just the walk to town. Sarah picked up her shawl and wrapped it around her shoulders with the same careful movements she'd used to fold the marriage paper 20 years ago. "I've been waiting this long," she said. "I suppose I can wait another hour to see what choice you make when it really matters." They walked toward Centerville as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains. 3 people bound together by absence and presence, debt and forgiveness, and the terrible hope that some things broken could still be made whole if handled with sufficient care and courage. The courthouse steps rose before them like an altar, and Thomas Wade faced the choice that would determine whether his daughter would grow up with a father or a cautionary tale, whether his wife would spend her remaining years as a woman who'd been loved, or a woman who'd been abandoned twice by the same man. The clock struck 5 as they reached the courthouse door, its bronze voice marking the moment when time stopped being an excuse and started being an opportunity for redemption. Judge Morrison, the same Morrison whose farm had sold that morning for $38, looked up from his desk with eyes that had seen too many families broken by pride and too few mended by grace. He was a thin man, with silver hair and hands that shook slightly as he reviewed the divorce papers Sarah had filed, the contest petition Thomas had just signed, and the bank drafts that settled Samuel Wade's debt once and for all. "Mrs. Wade," the judge said, his voice carrying the weight of official responsibility, "you filed for divorce citing abandonment and failure to provide support. Mr. Wade has now appeared to contest the decree. Are you prepared to withdraw your petition?" Sarah stood before the bench with Elizabeth beside her and Thomas slightly behind, as if he was still uncertain of his right to claim a place in their family configuration. The late afternoon light slanted through the courthouse windows, casting long shadows that reached toward the place where their future hung in balance. "Your Honor," Sarah said, her voice steady as stone, "I'd like to amend my petition rather than withdraw it." Thomas felt his heart stop, then restart with a rhythm that sounded like breaking glass. "I'm not seeking divorce," Sarah continued, her gaze fixed on Judge Morrison rather than the man whose fate she held in her hands. "I'm seeking a new marriage. To the man Thomas has become, not the boy who left 20 years ago. We were children when Pastor Hendricks married us, making promises we didn't understand to a future we couldn't imagine. I want to make those promises again, with full knowledge of what they cost and what they're worth." Judge Morrison leaned back in his chair, his silver eyebrows raised in surprise. In 40 years on the bench he'd seen plenty of marriages end, and precious few begin again. "That's not a legal proceeding this court can perform, Mrs. Wade. But I can dismiss your divorce petition, which would leave your original marriage intact." "Then that's what I'm asking for," Sarah said, finally turning to look at Thomas. "If he's willing to stay this time, really stay, not just until the next time staying gets difficult." Thomas stepped forward, his polished boots loud on the courthouse floor. He reached into his vest and withdrew the bank drafts that represented 20 years of careful living, disciplined saving, and success measured in dollars rather than devotion. "Your Honor," he said, his voice carrying the weight of a man who'd learned to speak in boardrooms and bank offices, "I'd like to make a deposit to the court's general fund. $847, representing the debt my father left unpaid. But I'm not paying it as Samuel Wade's son. I'm paying it as Thomas Wade, husband to Sarah and father to Elizabeth, settling accounts so we can start clean." He placed the money on the judge's desk, then reached for Sarah's hand. Her fingers were warm and slightly rough from garden work and household tasks, the hands of a woman who'd learned to build a life without help and now had to learn to share one with someone else. "The debt is settled," Judge Morrison announced, making notes in his ledger with careful precision. "The divorce petition is dismissed. The original marriage stands as recorded." He looked up at Thomas with something approaching approval. "Young man, you've got more luck than you deserve, and more wife than you've earned. Don't waste either one again." "I won't, Your Honor." They walked out of the courthouse as the sun touched the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose that promised a clear day tomorrow. The marriage paper was still in Sarah's satchel, still yellowed at the edges, still bearing the signatures they'd written as children who believed love was simple and staying was easy. Elizabeth walked between her parents down Centerville's main street, where gas lamps were beginning to flicker to life, and shopkeepers were closing their doors against the approaching evening. She was 20 years old and had spent her entire life as half an orphan, but now she walked like a daughter who belonged to something larger than her mother's determination and her absent father's guilt. "What happens now?" she asked, the question carrying the practical tone of someone who'd grown up managing difficult realities. Thomas looked at his wife, really looked, seeing the lines that 20 years had drawn around her eyes and the strength that 2 decades of independence had built into her shoulders. "Now we learn how to be married," he said. "Starting with the parts we should have learned 20 years ago." Sarah smiled for the first time since he'd stepped off the morning coach, the expression transforming her face from careful composure to genuine warmth. That might take a while. Good thing we've got time. They reached the Wade house on Willow Creek as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Smoke still rose from the chimney, steady and welcoming, and the windows glowed with lamplight that promised warmth against the October cold. Thomas had left this place as a boy running from responsibility, and he'd returned as a man ready to embrace it, even if it took the rest of his life to prove he deserved the chance. The courthouse bell struck 7 in the distance, its bronze voice marking time that no longer felt like an enemy but like a gift, hours and days and years stretching ahead of them, waiting to be filled with the ordinary miracles of staying, choosing, forgiving, and starting again. If you'd like more stories like this, stay a while. I'll tell the next one tomorrow night.